Hey, this is Emma again, and this will be our second video on AP Literature, and today we're going to be discussing the poetry essay. Obviously, poems are going to be formatted differently than a typical prose passage, however, the objective is going to remain the same, and that objective is to connect devices to meaning, and to display critical thinking. The goal of this video is to give you an overview of that process, recognizing devices and then connecting them to a larger meaning. And in the next video, we'll discuss a specific poetry prompt. Poetry can be the most intimidating of the three types of literature prompts, just because poems can be a little bit more abstract than a typical prose passage, but it's a very similar process to any other analytical essay. So don't be overwhelmed if you don't understand a poem the first time. Just force yourself to go through these steps, and sometimes a few extra runs through the passage will be necessary. Here are some steps. First, we're gonna look over the prompt. Again, like any other essay, it's going to have lots of important information. First off, you will be presented with either one or two poems, and with one poem you'll be asked to analyze that specific poem, and with two poems often you're asked to compare or contrast them. And so normally the prompt is going to give a quick introduction of one or two poems, their authors, relevant context, subject matter, etc. So here is an example of the introductory part of one of the prompts that the AP used. The following two poems present animal eye views of the world. Read each poem carefully. So that's your basic introduction. Sometimes it doesn't give you a whole lot of information, sometimes it gives you a full paragraph. Next, it's going to give you a task, and this is the part that we're going to focus on, because it's going to ask you to write with a specific focus. So the task in this prompt is, then write an essay in which you analyze the techniques used in the poems to characterize the speakers and convey differing views of the world. Sometimes the task is going to be very broad, like in this case, where it asks you to analyze how the literary techniques used in this poem contribute to its meaning. It really doesn't give you anything specific to focus on. However, sometimes the tasks can be quite specific, like in this prompt where it asks you to analyze how the poet conveys the complex relationship of the father and son through the use of literary devices such as point of view and structure. So not only is it asking you what to look for in terms of overarching themes, but it's also discussing the devices that will lead you to those themes. No matter what, each prompt is asking you asking for you to analyze specific elements of the language and then tie it to a larger meaning. The question now is how to go about doing that. Well, when you're reading through your prompt, say we're using our first example, you'll want to underline or highlight key components. So when I'm reading through it, I'll read, the following two poems present the animal eye views of the world. Read each poem carefully. That part is the introduction part. Oftentimes you won't need that's not any key information to your task. Then we get to this part. Then write an essay in which you analyze the techniques used in the poems to characterize the speakers and convey differing views of the world. So now, techniques is a very broad term that encompasses a vast range of material. However, you do know that when reading through these poems, you're going to want to focus on how various devices that you notice, it's leaving it open for you to determine which devices you're going to focus on, and how those devices characterize each subject and how that relates to the overarching view of the world for each respective animal. So here's a compilation of prompts that have been provided for students in the past few years. If you want to pause and take a look, in purple I've put the specific devices that the prompt asks you to consider, and in red I've highlighted the overall meaning that you are expected to address. You can think of the prompt as a very basic guide for the rest of your essay. Hey, that sounds kind of familiar, like when we talked about the thesis being the roadmap for your essay. And well, they kind of both are. The thesis should really address the prompt, but before we can get more into theses in poetry essays, we have to talk about reading and understanding the passage. So now we're moving on to the poem or the poems themselves. And the way I'll organize the next little section of this video is I'm going to break it down into how I would suggest timing the planning and the writing of your essay. So timing. I would take the first 5 to 10 minutes to read or annotate, and you have a few options here. You can read through once and then go back again and annotate, or the second option is what I always chose to do: read and annotate simultaneously and then go through and do that process a few times over. So this will be an important part of the process, as poetry can be difficult to understand. Remember that very few people can take away something truly meaningful in the first read through. So I'd recommend reading the poem many different times, because if you don't understand it, then multiple reads will often help grasp the basic ideas, and then if you do understand it, the next read always brings some new ideas to light. So now we have to transition from the prompt to the poem, and it can be helpful, very helpful, and I would highly suggest to look for the devices and meaning specified in the prompt to give you some guidance. But you are by no means limited to these devices, and the meaning can be stretched and broadened, and most of these prompts are there to guide, not to instruct incredibly specific paths, because they want the AP and your teachers, they want to see you thinking critically for yourself. So if you can come up with more meaning and more devices that weren't specified in the prompt, only strengthens your essay. So some general things to look for. I'd suggest looking out for these or noting them in your essay if you notice that they come up multiple times, even if they aren't specified in the prompt, like I said. So some general things are the purpose of the author, the purpose, their overarching purpose. Then even more specific, you want to look at the purpose of the paragraph, the sentence, and even sometimes the word choice is very purposeful. Next, the tone. And if we remember, the tone is the author's attitude towards a subject. And this may require a few read-throughs, because oftentimes it's easy to let something like irony slip past your attention. Next is mood, and again, that's the character's feeling, attitude towards a subject. The audience, the point of view, and the structure of a poem. E.E. Cummings has lots of strangely structured poems. That's an example of a poet who oftentimes the structure holds some meaning. We'll also see structure playing a part in our analysis on the prompt that we'll cover more specifically in the next video. And finally, and one of the most important things to look out for are shifts. Shifts are integral to your understanding and analysis of the poem, because oftentimes the shifts indicate an important source of tension, whether it's in tone or mood or imagery or any of those other things. And I would also suggest that you let the shifts in the poem dictate the structure of your essay, as in each time you start a new body paragraph, it correlates to a shift in the poem. That can be a very helpful organizational tool. Now on to some specific devices that you should look out for when reading a poem closely. First, you have your comparisons, simile and metaphor, and you want to ask yourself, why is the author comparing these two things? What does this say about the subject? Also, considering denotative versus connotative meanings. So the denotative meaning would be the literal definition, whereas the connotation is the emotional meaning. And oftentimes the poem will lend itself to analysis of the connotative meaning. Next, we have imagery, which is language that appeals to the 5 senses. It's often seen in sonnets, which are specific types of poems that are seen on the AP a lot, and they are often romantic and involve repeated images of nature. Next would be paradox, or seeming contradiction, and it's often a tool of irony or of humor. And next, a very important device that you will see, I can almost guarantee, on every AP Lit poem or prose passage, is repetition. And you can look for repetition in strands, as in within the sentence and structure. You can also look for parallelism. It can refer to letters with alliteration. Repetition of words often is used to emphasize a certain idea. Something you'll see in poems is repeated symbols or images, and the question to ask yourself there is, why does the author choose to repeat or to emphasize this image or this symbol? What does that say about the overarching meaning of the poem? Another thing that you'll see in almost every poem passage, quite prevalent, is contrast. Again, some sort of tension between two disparate ideas. Next, we have hyperbole, which is just exaggeration. It's a tool of irony, humor. It's often used to in satire. The opposite of that would be understatement, which is seen often in British writing. Jane Austen loves understatement. Also can be used as a tool of irony, or sometimes just a stylistic choice. Next, we have personification, and personification often is there to point out a connection between humanity and some non-human thing that's being personified, and to bring it to life, to give it a larger meaning. Finally, this is specific to poems, is rhyme, and the rhyme scheme of a poem, or the lack thereof, can often reveal a tone. If it's rhyming and it kind of has a bouncing rhyme scheme, it gives the poem a more light and friendly feel, whereas if there's no rhyme scheme, it perhaps might have a more serious tone. And I mean, there are always variations, and that's not law, but oftentimes rhyme will dictate the tone. A helpful organizational tool that we've discussed in previous videos is the T-chart, and that is just a chart that connects device to meaning, or if we go back to our specific to general model, the device being the specific, and broadening that to a general meaning, which is this connection is ultimately the goal of the entire essay. This tool can help organize your thoughts. So you say you see some repetition, then you can write your device there, but you can't leave out the meaning, and oftentimes repetition is linked to emphasis, or hyperbole to irony, or let's say a metaphor romanticized something in the specific poem I was reading. Again, T-charts, they're not necessary, but if you're having trouble finding that connection from the device to the meaning, this is a helpful tool to just kind of make tangible those connections. So now that we've gone over our preliminary reading section of the timing, that would be 5 to 10 minutes, we'll move on to 5 to 10 minutes of essay planning. And what I normally did was I normally planned out the general ideas of each body paragraph at the bottom of the page, so I could see the direction that my essay would take, and it also helped later on to inform my thesis. And so that would be the kind of outlining section of this planning stage. Something to keep in mind is chronology. Chronology is very important. I would not recommend organizing by device or by some other kind of paragraph structure. It becomes confusing for both you and your reader. So again, like I said earlier, I normally go through and separate my paragraphs in my essay based on the shifts in the passage. Next in the planning phase is the thesis statement, and something again to keep in mind is that you want to make points that you can argue. You want to be specific enough that you give a guide for the rest of your essay, but also general enough to have space to work and expand on your argument within your essay. You don't want to have quotes or specific details. It's really, again, the roadmap to your essay. So it's going to connect the general prompt to the specific arguments that you're going to make within your body paragraphs in your essay. The thesis will also set up the chronology of your essay, so make it chronological. I can't stress this point enough. It really helped me to follow those shifts in the poems, of which there will likely be many, and to explore the nuances as the passage continues. Really follow the flow of the poem and don't simplify it down to a few adjectives. Delve into the nuances of your passage. So here's a quick example of thesis statement writing. Let's say my prompt asks me the task at hand is to reveal how literary techniques like imagery and point of view contribute to the protagonist's view of humanity. Here is an example that we will try to improve upon. Here I say, through imagery and point of view, the author reveals that the protagonist detests humanity. Now, clearly this is not a very strong thesis because I just repeat the points in the prompt, the imagery and point of view. I don't say anything about the specific imagery or point of view, so that doesn't really help me guide the rest of my essay. And also, the author revealing that the protagonist detests humanity, that would be a very strong sentiment that perhaps he detests humanity at one point, but in the AP prompts you're going to have a much more complex kind of progression of emotion or feeling or whatever they're asking you to analyze. So let's say I wanted to improve upon that thesis or expand on it. This is what an AP Lit thesis, a stronger one, might look like. Through vivid descriptions of the protagonist's internal monologue throughout the passage and the repeated contrast of darkness in relation to the protagonist and lightness in relation to the outside world, the author proves that the protagonist's desire to fit in has driven him first to hope, later depression, and finally to seclusion. So first I describe the imagery. The specific imagery that I will discuss is this darkness versus lightness, and I will also this point of view is an internal monologue. So I've given a much more specific guide to the rest of my essay. I also show the shifts that I've seen in the poem. I see that this is an underlying desire to fit in, but also this is probably going to be represented by three shifts: the hope, depression, and then seclusion. And those are going to, again, in a good essay, that chronology, hopefully I've gone through the passage chronologically, and that will dictate the chronology of my own essay. Of course, we're going to go through a much more realistic kind of example of thesis statement and prompts and an entire essay in the next video. So look out for that. Now that we've done our 5 to 10 minutes both reading and planning, now we have 20 to 30 minutes for writing, and with a good plan it should take you about that much time. The really essential part of this essay writing process is, surprisingly, it comes before even writing, at least for me. And again, this is just some guidelines if you're getting stuck on your essay writing. But within the writing portion of the essay, you want to have an introduction that again gives background information, which would be the title, the author, the time period, any other background information that seems relevant, and then definitely a summary of the poem or poems. And you may not know all this information, but just give as much of it as you're provided with or as you know. And then you're also going to have your complex thesis. It's going to be multifaceted, as we discussed about 40 seconds ago. Next, you'll have your body paragraphs that are going to be structured like a little mini person. Here is the topic sentence, that again will follow the path set by the thesis, which is ideally chronological, and it will follow the flow of the passage, but it's going to give you an introduction to the argument you're going to make in your body paragraph. Next, you're going to give some context that will introduce your evidence or your quotes which you're going to need, and finally your analysis. And this analysis section is the most important part of the body paragraph. Well, they're all, of course, vital to the body paragraph, but the analysis is what is going to tie the quotes to the topic sentence, and then back even further to the overarching purpose, the thesis. And this is where your device to meaning T-charts are going to come in handy, because it's where you're going to identify the device of the quote and then connect it to some sort of larger meaning. And you'll connect that repetition to emphasis, or the contrast to the tension. And something to keep in mind for all essays is to employ strong verbs. Instead of saying the author uses repetition, say he repeated. Instead of saying there is personification to describe a tree, you say the tree is personified. Cut out extra words and use strong verbs. That is something that always helps tighten up and polish an essay, even if it is a first draft, which all of these in-class essays are going to be. Finally, you're going to have your conclusion. And again, like we've talked about with every other conclusion, this concluding paragraph is ideally going to see you taking a step back and gleaning some new meaning from this poem. And now we have this beautiful little snowman body to represent our essay. And now we're going to review how the time is split up. So in the end, you're going to spend 5 to 10 minutes reading and annotating, 5 to 10 outlining, planning your paragraphs, and then 20 to 30 minutes writing. This is an imperfect graph, but hey, I'm the English person, so what can I say? Anyway, this has been an overview of the AP Lit poetry essay. I hope that it was helpful. Next time we're going to cover a specific poetry prompt. And yeah, so tune in for that, and thanks for watching.